Good evening, 4th grade. Today's mini lesson is on comparing fractions when one denominator has to be changed. So please write this as the title on your next page. When you have done that, unpause, close your math notebook, and just concentrate with me. So speaking of, remember comparing fractions, we started that the other day. And that means we're looking at fractions, which ones are greater than or less than, or are they equal to each other if we look at 2. And we did that, one way we did that easily was with fraction bars. You know, if I want to compare like 2/3 to 3/4, you know, I can build it with the bars and see which one's longer. And that's a fine strategy, except what if you don't have fraction bars handy? A lot of times that's, you know, when you take a DA or a milestones, like fraction bars are not really always going to be available to you. And so as you can see, it's easy to tell this is greater, but not by a lot. And so if you just had to draw it, might be hard to trust your drawing when they're that close. So that's not always a strategy you can use if you don't have the fraction bars. And then we kind of fell back on number lines as a plan B. But remember, number lines, same thing. If the fractions are close, it's no problem. Like if I was going to compare like 1/3 to 3/4, you know, it's pretty easy to tell, okay, well that's definitely less. But if I wanted to compare 2/3 to 3/4, that's awfully close, and I may not trust that I drew it exactly right when they're that close to say, they really might be equivalent, or this one might be a little greater, or I could have drawn it wrong and this is a little greater. So number lines are good like this when the fractions are not close, but when they are close, a lot of times it's just not a helpful strategy. So I want to show you another one that you can use in any situation. And with no fraction bars. So let's look at this question. In the pacer test, Allison ran 2/3 of a mile. Caitlin ran 5/9 of a mile. Who ran farther? So the big lesson I want you to take away today is it is very hard to compare fractions, especially when they're close, and these are pretty close, that don't have the same denominator. This is hard to compare. But fractions like, I'll just make 2 up. If I had asked you which of these was greater, these are also close. But if they have the same denominator, it's really, really, really easy to tell that 6/12 is more than 5/12. So our strategy today is going to be to change one of the fractions so that they both have the same denominator. I'm going to take 2/3 and I'm going to change it to 9ths. And if this is 9ths and this is 9ths, it's going to be very easy to tell which of these is greater. So the strategy I'm going to use to do that is the partition drawing strategy. Just because I know I can always do that by drawing, I don't need tiles, I don't need circles. You know, I can always find an equivalent fraction pretty easily with that strategy. So what I want to do, I want to take my 2/3, I want to take my 5/9, and I'm going to partition my smaller fraction into 9ths to make a greater one. So I'm going to draw my 2/3. Let me remind you how this strategy works. It's been a while. If this wasn't your favorite, you may not have used it in a while. And so I'm going to draw 2/3. 1, 2/3. And then I'm going to partition it the other direction. So I'm going to partition, which means sort of cut it the other direction to make it into 9ths. So if I partition it once, I'm going to have 6 parts. So that's not enough. So if I partition it twice, now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 parts. I've changed my thirds into 9ths. It's the same fraction. I didn't change how much was shaded. I'm just making an equivalent fraction here. So now instead of being 3 parts with 2 shaded, it is 9 parts with 6 shaded, which means an equivalent fraction to 2/3 is 6/9, so the same amount. And the reason I did that is now if I want to compare 6/9 to 5/9, it's very easy to tell now which fraction is greater than that, if they have the same denominator. So now I can easily tell, okay, well, Allison ran 2/3. Allison ran farther, because she ran 6/9 of a mile. Caitlin ran 5/9. All right, let's do one together. All right. 3/10 of the students in one class scored distinguished on their last EA. 1/5 of the students in another class did. Which class had more distinguished students? So we need to compare 3/10 to 1/5. One easy mistake to make is right off the bat say, well, 3 is bigger than 1, 10 is bigger than 5. This one has bigger numbers, so this one's going to be greater. That's not how fractions necessarily work. If I go back to Allison and Caitlin, Allison's numbers were smaller in the problem, but she still ran farther when we found the equivalent fraction. So you can't say, well, 2/3 is less than 5/9, because those are small numbers and those are bigger. It doesn't work that way. You're going to have to compare by finding a common denominator. So these are too hard to tell. So I'm going to write, I need same denominator in order to compare. So what I'm going to do, I've got 3/10 and I've got 1/5, and I'm going to change my fifths into tenths, and that way I can compare them. So I'm going to draw my 1/5 model. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts. I'm going to shade in 1. So there's my 1/5. And if you want to write down, now I'm going to partition in 2. So I'm going to cut it in 2, because if I cut it that way, now I've got 10 pieces. Instead of having 5 pieces with 1 shaded, now I have 10 pieces with 2 shaded. And it's easy now to compare 3/10 to 2/10. I can obviously tell that the 3/10 class had more distinguished. All right. And that's how it works. So I can just change one of the fractions to match the denominator of the other, and then I know. So, that's just 2 examples. So if you feel like you've got it after these 2, you kind of understand how this works, you're all set. If you need to go back and watch either the I do or the we do again, just to make sure you have a good foundation on this, that is fine too. But once you feel like you got it, once you got it written down, you're all set. See you tomorrow.